Hey yo, this the KID, the Kid Capri, man. You know how it goes down. We don't do nothing without no DJ, alright? That's what you watching.
Are you a part of the culture?
Yo, what's going on? We are back. This is the Without No DJ podcast, and I got a very, very, very special guest with me today. We had him previously, but that was before COVID, and he's back. He's of the Executioners, the X-Men, the great teacher himself, DJ Rob Swift. How you doing, brother?
I'm chilling. I'm alive. Survived COVID. Still here, DJing and spreading the hip hop gospel. And I'm super happy to be here with you, bro.
Man,
in person and not FaceTime or
a
texting.
Zoom or something.
Word.
Would have ran out of Zoom minutes.
Exactly.
Now, let's talk about COVID because that's what we initially came in on. How was COVID for you, and how did you pivot from COVID as a DJ?
COVID was actually one of my best fiscal years.
Oh, yeah?
In my career. Yeah. And a part of me feels a little guilty even saying that because I know a lot of people were struggling. People passed away. People got sick. Friends of mine got sick and caught COVID and stuff. But for me, it was interesting. Before COVID, I had a lot of students that I taught on Skype. Right. And they would set up time with me to train for like an hour or two because they didn't live in New York, couldn't come to my home studio to train with me. And so we would set up Skype sessions and train that way. And I'm talking about students across the globe, from Asia to Australia to Europe, everywhere, Canada, US. I had students and I scheduled hour-long sessions with them. Then COVID hit.
Right.
And what ended up happening was I accumulated more students because a lot of people just had all this time on their hands.
Right.
They were home bored, not doing anything. And it's interesting how the DJ community took to social media to post more videos of themselves from their bedrooms, scratching it up, having fun, going live.
Right.
Live streaming became a big thing. Everyone was on Twitch.
Yeah.
And so because of that, I got more students because people wanted to learn how to DJ properly. You know, the interesting thing about the pandemic lockdown was, with regards to DJing, being that everyone took to Twitch, you had to showcase some kind of skill to stand out amongst all the DJs that were live streaming. Yeah. So a lot of those people that wanted to level up came to me. And what ended up happening was, during the pandemic, because I got so bogged down with students, I ended up launching the official Brolic Army DJ School online.
Wow.
So it's like I was teaching already online because, as I said before, I was setting up Skype sessions with students all over the world. But it started to get a little overwhelming, you know, having to keep up with all of these different sessions.
Of course.
And students, let's say in Australia, that for them was easier to train when it was like 8 a.m. for me, for example. Right. But it's COVID. You want to make sure the bills are getting paid. So you're taking on all these students, and launching Brolic Army DJ School just facilitated one hub, one place where all of these students that I accumulated throughout that year can go to and watch the lessons on their time.
Right.
And so the short answer of it is I came out really good, you know? And again, I struggle saying that because I know that it was a tough year for a lot of people, but I think for DJs, it ended up being like a benchmark moment, you know? Sure. I think there are more DJs today because of that lockdown than there were pre-COVID. So as far as the DJ community is concerned, in a weird way, it ended up benefiting our community.
Yes. Now, as far as when COVID first happened, do you remember where you were and any events that you had lined up? And it's like, man, I can't go to the Grammys or X, Y, Z.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
No, I do remember. I actually didn't take it as serious as it turned out to be. I remember thinking, remember when there was like was it the swine flu a few years ago?
Yeah.
And there was talk about it, but it was just talk. So I thought it was the same thing. Oh, this is hoopla, you know.
Like monkeypox.
Right. The media's just, trying to scare us.
Yeah.
And then at the time, I had a residency at a spot called Interboro in Brooklyn, New York.
Right.
It's a really cool brewery where I had a monthly party, and I had the likes of Pete Rock perform with me.
Wow.
Diamond D. This was like a really fun party. It was called Rob Swift and Friends.
Okay.
Big up to my girl Caitlin, who at the time worked at Interboro and facilitated this opportunity for me to have this really fun party. And I would invite my students to also DJ. So it was a really cool environment. And we had Prince Paul booked to DJ this party. And talks of COVID started to really amplify in the media. Next thing you know, you're hearing about other DJs that you know who are canceling their parties. And I'm like, whoa, this is real. This is
very real.
Yeah. And so what ended up happening was, I think it was March, right? When the lockdown officially started, March of 2021.
Yep.
I had Prince Paul scheduled to come rock, Rob Swift and Friends. I had the students lined up. They were going to DJ. And I remember Prince Paul hit me up and he was like, dude, I don't know if we should do this party. He kind of initiated the talks of whether or not we should cancel.
Right.
And he was like, I'm not sure if we should do this party because people were starting to get sick in New York City. And there was that fear that people had of catching this new virus, and that fear just kind of took over the city, and what ended up happening was the party got canceled. So, it is what it is. That's the past, but it would have been nice to DJ with Prince Paul. I've never DJ'd with him, and I was super looking forward to this event. But yeah, he was like, dude, I don't know if we should do it. And then like within a day or two of receiving a call from him, Interboro was like, yeah, we're going to have to cancel. Like the city's, they're like locking everything down.
That hurts.
Yeah.
That hurts. Were you an idiot like me and put on your mask to go check the mailbox and you're like, riding around your car with a mask on?
Yeah, or you were doing your laundry with a mask on. You know what I mean? Like, I remember like just being scared to touch doors and stuff like that. It was serious, or like shaking hands, like, but giving the elbow to your boy. Like it was serious, and I'm just glad that we got through it. And like that was a crazy period. Like I'm a huge gym buff. Like I love working out, and like I was just going crazy not being able to get to the gym. Like I would go to parks, so I'd find like scaffolding in my neighborhood and do pull-ups on scaffolding because like I just was going nuts at home not being able to lift weights or anything. But again, with regards to DJing, the lockdown, COVID was actually good for the industry in a lot of ways because more people started DJing, and I feel more DJs took the skill aspect of what we do serious because you're on Twitch exposed. You can't, you're not at some residency just kind of on your phone letting a record play on your laptop. Like now you're on Twitch, people are at home like, all right, what is it that you do? You know? And so I feel like although the lockdown was negative for a lot of people, for industries like mine, it was actually sort of positive. Yeah. Unless you had a residency somewhere and your residency ended. But again, a lot of those DJs took to Twitch, and now they have Twitch channels and are still rocking weekly and making money off Twitch, or streaming. So yeah, it was an interesting time for us.
Now, did you pivot and do like any Zoom parties, any corporate parties, or anything of that sort?
No, I'm not Zoom live streamer type of DJ.
Okay.
That's not where my passion is. I'd rather DJ in front of people, document it, and then post it for people to see, right? But I'm not really one to live stream or record videos of myself in my room and then upload them to YouTube or Instagram and wait for people's responses. A couple of instances occurred where, I don't know if you're familiar with Tony Touch.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So Tony Touch began live streaming his Toca Tuesday famous party in New York City. He started live streaming it because we couldn't go to clubs, right? So he invited me to appear on it, and I ended up doing like a couple of DJ workshops for the U.S. Embassy.
Oh, that's cool.
During the COVID lockdown. That was fun. But I personally myself didn't start up a Twitch channel or anything like that. It's
That's
just
awesome.
really not my preference with regards to DJing.
So you took more of your classes and turned them into like tutorials per se?
Exactly. That's
Which is
exactly what I
very
did.
smart.
That's exactly what I did. Yeah. So Brolic Army DJ School is an online school that I launched smack dab in the middle of COVID. And it's a hub where students of the art of DJing can go and learn about the techniques involved with this, because there's a lot of mysticism behind DJing still in 2023 that escapes a lot of people. Like, you could watch someone DJ and then buy the gear, buy the laptop, and attempt to do what you see other people do, and then it hits you. This is hard. And there's a lot behind what I saw this DJ do at a particular nightclub. You know, DJs that make it look easy actually are the ones that have spent their 10,000 hours training and getting to that point where what you do just comes natural.
Sure.
And so the school, I personally feel, is the best, to be honest with you, because I don't just teach the techniques. I go into the history of DJing. I go into the history of hip hop so that my students have context on what they're learning. And I think on the flip side, with regards to the COVID pandemic lockdown and the influx of DJs into our community, our scene, it, as positive as it was in a sense that more people started DJing and the community grew and the discipline of DJing became more popular, there's also a negative to that, because I feel like people, not everyone, it's, let's say, new to DJing within the last 3 years, but some of those people, I feel, picked up this hobby for the sake of just having something to do. And I feel like this art deserves more. You know, like, if you're going to pick up DJing, take the time to learn about the art and the history of the art. And so now, a lot of times when I'm scrolling through Instagram or TikTok, I might see a really cute girl in front of a controller, and she hits play, and then she smiles at the camera, and then the music's playing, and then there's like this font on the screen, but she's not doing anything to the music. But she's considered a DJ in the eyes of many people. And so, me being the DJ that I am, I feel like that's an appropriation of our culture. You know, like, okay, you picked up DJing during the pandemic because you had nothing to do, and now you have, like, millions of views on videos because the lighting in your room is perfect and you're attractive looking, not because you're actually contributing to the art from a creative standpoint. And so I feel like Brolic Army DJ School exists to offset that.
Good. We need that. We need more of that.
Word.
So within me watching and doing my research on interviews that you've done in the past, I've noticed that you don't only talk about the art form of DJing, but you, like you said, you talk about the history of DJing. You talk about blacks and Latinos and basically how we got here, the challenges we experienced. Can you elaborate on that for us?
Oh, for sure. I'd love to, actually, because this is important information. And after all, it is the 50th year of hip hop, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm glad that you asked that, because there's more to DJing than winning a competition. And a lot of times when I sit down with podcasters, I get asked questions like, when did you win your first battle? What inspired you to DJ? And there's backstories and history to how I ended up sitting here in front of you that goes as far back as the Great Depression, to be honest with you.
Wow.
Yeah, and I know wow is the response I expect, because what does the Great Depression have to do with Kool Herc and Africa Bambaataa?
Right.
But there's a lot of synergy between the two, although there's a huge time gap. Okay. And what I mean by that is this. In 1925, an urban planner named Robert Moses was hired by New York City to contribute to the government's urban renewal strategies that were starting to be implemented in New York and in parts of California, Detroit, Chicago, across the country. And this is now post Jim Crow America, right? So, you know, we're here in Charlotte, North Carolina. I know we have like guests here sitting in on this podcast, and I know you guys, whether you're black, white, have heard about Jim Crow laws, laws that existed to further the inequality that minorities, quote unquote, were experiencing, predominantly black, let's say. So urban renewal plans basically revolved around, in New York City, I'll speak about New York because that's where I'm from.
Right.
During the Great Depression, that created a lot of slums.
Right.
And the Bronx, New York was one of those areas in New York City that was affected by the Great Depression. Middle-class people lost jobs, couldn't pay their rents. The city itself started suffering.
Right.
And as a result, I was driving through Charlotte today, getting to a mall to get freshened up for this podcast interview.
I see it.
And I was looking at the houses, bro, and like the lawns and the trees and everything is just manicured so well here. And I was just like, man, like I'd love to live here.
Right.
Picture the exact opposite in the late 1920s in the Bronx. Like, extreme poverty, cities, neighborhoods were not being manicured. And because of that, slums evolved, right? Robert Moses was hired to clean up the city, right? And he was an urban planner. And so what he did was he supervised the construction of highways, of parks, of beaches in New York City and in the suburbs of New York.
Right.
So in 1925, he began supervising the construction of the Southern State Parkway. Now, how is that relevant to hip hop? This is how. Robert Moses, to put it bluntly, was a racist, but he was put in this position to rebuild New York City.
Right.
So here's an example of the kind of stuff this guy did. In 1925, as I said, he started construction of the Southern State Parkway. The Southern State Parkway was a highway that facilitated a means for people in New York City to get to beaches in Long Island, to get to swimming pools in the city.
Right.
And he supervised all this. Now, with regards to the Southern State Parkway, this guy, Robert Moses, man, an urban planner, instructed the people building the highways, or the Southern State Parkway specifically, You know how like when you're driving through a highway and you reach like an underpass, and that underpass is basically a bridge where people can walk from one side of town to the next side of town, or maybe bike over or drive over, because there's this highway. He instructed the people building the Southern State Parkway to build the bridges connecting the different sides of one neighborhood to another low enough so that New York City buses can't drive through, because he didn't want inner city kids riding the buses or minority families riding the buses and getting to beaches like Jones Beach, or getting to the suburbs of Long Island. So he literally mandated that they build the bridges connecting the different parts of the towns that were cut off by the Southern State Parkway low enough so that city buses couldn't drive through.
Wow.
Another crazy thing that this guy did was the pools. He would instruct the people designing the pools to keep the water temperature. And I'm not lying. This sounds crazy as I say it. I'm like, yo, this is nuts. But this is documented historical facts that you could Google if you want. Robert Moses instructed the people building the pools to maintain the water temperature low. I forget, he said below a certain amount of degrees, because black folk don't like swimming in cold water. This is documented quotes from Robert Moses. Which is true,
by the way.
Yeah, yeah. So the point in me bringing that up is that the city went from Jim Crow. You know, Jim Crow really didn't affect the North the way it did the South.
Right.
But what I'm trying to say is that New York adapted Jim Crow mentalities, a Jim Crow mindset, and applied it to urban renewal.
Right.
You know? Another thing that you got to factor in with regards to highways like the Southern State Parkway, or another, which was built, they started building the Southern State Parkway in 1925 and finished in, I believe it was 1962.
Wow.
It was finished.
Okay.
In 1948, Robert Moses started supervising a new project, which was the construction of the Cross Bronx Expressway. Now we're talking about the Bronx, New York City. And what this guy did was he basically supervised the demolition of neighborhoods where blacks and Latinos lived, and Irish and Polish and Jewish. The Bronx after World War II was actually very diverse. So I would say around the 1940s through the 1970s, after World War II ended like in 1945, a lot of Puerto Ricans, a lot of black people from the South started to migrate up north and settle in New York City, in places like the Bronx, New York. And so being that Irish people were already there, Jewish people were already there, Polish, Italians, now there's this influx of Puerto Ricans and blacks. To be honest with you, and unfiltered, white people started to kind of be like, well, what's going on? There's this influx now of like Puerto Ricans and blacks, and like, you know, I'm here because I'm amongst my own, right? And so I raised that to say that white flight started to take place once the construction of these highways began. So Robert Moses literally created a path for white people to leave boroughs like the Bronx because of this influx of Puerto Rican people and black people to the city. And so not only did he destroy neighborhoods and displace people that, you know, now needed to find a place to live because their buildings were demolished by the construction of this highway.
Right.
He also, Robert Moses, created a pathway for white people to take part in what we term white flight. People left the Bronx and went up to places like Westchester and Long Island and other suburbs.
Okay.
And so what ended up happening was in this urban renewal planning that started to take place in New York City, there was this indirect negative effect on quote unquote minorities, specifically blacks and Puerto Ricans, because now they're displaced, right? And this dude, Robert Moses, is instructing the supervisors of these highways, for example, the Southern State Parkway, to build the bridges connecting one town to the other on these highways low enough so that city buses couldn't drive through there because he didn't want quote unquote minorities to get to the beaches. So he's literally destroying neighborhoods, but then trapping black and Puerto Rican people inside the Bronx, you know,
Wow.
and other parts of the city. I grew up in Jackson Heights, Queens, and we experienced our similar version of that as well in the 70s. So to answer your question, you know, yes, like the history of this culture that we called hip hop has its roots that are just way deeper than just a guy named Kool Herc that decided to do a party. It's like, what brought Kool Herc to the Bronx?
Right.
What brought Puerto Ricans and blacks to the Bronx? It was this opportunity, the American dream, a chance to make money, find work.
Right.
But because of that influx of minorities, white people got scared, left, took advantage of the roads that were being built by Robert Moses, an urban planner in New York City who was racist.
Right.
And you have the Bronx, New York now, that's basically a slum. Remnants of the Great Depression are affecting it. The destruction of neighborhoods because of highways like the Cross Bronx Expressway and the Southern State Parkway
Right.
affected it. So like hip hop is a product of these policies that our government implemented. And so it's important to touch on these things on the 50th year of hip hop because there's more to this story than a guy deciding to cut breaks back and forth.
Correct.
You know?
Correct. And I've also heard you talk about the influence of government policies. And correct me if I'm wrong. I may be pronouncing it wrong, but the benign neglect, what that had on hip hop. And I want to ask you, how did that influence hip hop in general? And then on top of that, a person like Kool Herc or Africa Bambaataa, what does that mean exactly?
Right on. So benign neglect is a policy that was implemented by President Richard Nixon. He was advised by his political advisor, a guy named Patrick Moynihan, that the time may have come where the issue of race could benefit from a period of benign neglect.
Right.
And this is a famous quote from a memo that he sent Richard Nixon on the issue of race.
Okay.
Our government was basically throwing their hands up and saying, nothing that we're doing is solving the black issue. Mind you, this is right after the civil rights movement. Let's just leave the blacks alone and see if they could fix the issue themselves. And the interesting thing about that is benign neglect basically is a means for our government to throw their hands up, not do anything about what was affecting black families in places like the Bronx. And as a result, bust this, bro. You know how I was referencing me driving to the mall this morning and seeing like how well manicured Charlotte is with the lawns and the houses. Well, with benign neglect, boroughs like the Bronx, specifically sections like the South Bronx, were being ignored.
Okay.
And so the neighborhoods weren't being manicured. The sanitation department was literally using the South Bronx as a dumping zone, dumping trash in the South Bronx.
What?
Literally dumping trash in the South Bronx. Emergency services like ambulance or the fire department were cut.
Okay.
So if you had a fire, like, no one was showing up to put that fire out. And that's why when you look at pictures of the Bronx, let's say now if you Google 1970s hip hop, you'll see pictures of the Bronx with the pioneers of hip hop posing with burnt buildings as a landscape and rubble all around them, but like posing, you know, like with gold chains and like shades on, but like in the background, it's just
World
War III, literally, right?
Yeah.
And that's because of a policy called benign neglect that Richard Nixon implemented after being advised to do so by his advisor, Patrick Moynihan. And it's deep, man. Like, when you think about it, like, New York, specifically the Bronx, was just ignored. And the citizens, the residents of the Bronx were just left to figure out life,
Right.
economics, and how to feed their families on their own. And, you know, our government is supposed to be for the people, by the people, but yet it wasn't for the people, and the people were ignored, you know?
Right.
And so that had a huge impact on hip hop. Another thing that is important to consider with regards to the politics of hip hop and the economics of hip hop, especially in the 1970s, is this. Don't think that there weren't black families that wanted to leave. Imagine you're growing up in an area where the landlord in your building wants to gentrify the building, but can't, right?
Right.
And so he burns the building down. Landlords were literally burning their own buildings to try to get the residents to leave because they wanted to gentrify the Bronx. So imagine living in a building where you have to now leave because the landlord paid some kids to burn it down or set it on fire himself. Like, landlords, slumlords were literally arsonists and collecting insurance money on the building and then just breaking out and buying property, you know, in the suburbs or in Westchester. Stuff like this was happening. And that's why the images of the Bronx, if you Google them in the 1970s, are what they are.
Right.
So couple that with redlining. Here's another government sanctioned policy that was subsidized by banks across the country. But
Right.
I'm referencing New York because, you know, I'm from New York City.
Of course.
So if all that isn't enough for you guys, redlining is a practice where you pull out a map, right, of New York City, and you see the 5 boroughs, right? And let's say you're trying to decide which regions of New York City you want white, wealthy, well-to-do people to live, and which regions of New York City you want impoverished, quote-unquote, minorities to stay.
Right.
Right?
Oh, wow.
So you take out this map, you take out a marker, and then you start drawing borders around the areas where there's a high concentration of blacks and Latinos.
Right.
So you draw red borders, and that section of the Bronx, New York City, or in my case, it was Jackson Heights where I grew up, is deemed as undesirable to live. So what that means is implants from other states that arrive in New York and are looking for a place to live,
Right.
go to the bank, and the bank basically steers them away from living in the red part of that map. And in the case of the 1970s, it was the Bronx because white flight, right?
Okay.
Benign neglect, how those policies indirectly or directly, if you really think about it, because it was basically an extension of Jim Crow, just a legal way of segregating people.
Right.
Right? So banks would literally deter wealthy whites from living in certain areas and be like, yo, yeah, that area here, red, you don't want to live here. There's an area here in green where there's a lot of white people, where there's hardly any or no black folk. You'll be happy here. And so redlining literally was a practice of legal segregation that took place in New York City and other parts of the country, Chicago, California. It wasn't just New York. And so I think the pertinent issue there is, or question is, how, again, did these black folk ended up living in such a, like, third world, quote unquote, so to speak, place? Like, how is it that in New York City you have a region that looks like Vietnam? Like, how is that possible? Right? And this is how, like, the Great Depression, Robert Moses building these highways, destroying neighborhoods, displacing families, benign neglect, policies that our government literally enforced that basically revolved around them just not doing anything for black people, citizens, Americans, right?
Right.
Redlining,
Right.
banks literally compartmentalizing sections of New York City into desirable because there's white people, not desirable because there's blacks and Latinos.
Right.
And what I'll say in closing to your question is that another thing that I want you guys here to consider, and everyone watching this podcast, is, as I was saying earlier, it's not like black folk and Puerto Rican folk didn't want to leave.
Right.
But banks were only subsidizing white families to leave the Bronx. Irish people, Polish, Italian, they were only subsidizing white families. So what I mean by subsidizing is they would broker loans for them to leave and buy houses so they could take out a mortgage on a house in Westchester or in Long Island and use the roadways that Robert Moses built to get out of the Bronx. But if you were a Puerto Rican family or a black family that wanted to do that, you wouldn't get the loan because you were seen as a risk.
Right.
Right? So it's a lot of information. If you have to, rewatch this podcast and break down everything bit by bit. And that's how you get to the 1970s Bronx, where it's impoverished,
Right.
where gangs are running the streets. Why? Because of policies like benign neglect. No one meaning officials, whether it's the police department, the fire department, ambulances, weren't supervising the Bronx.
Right.
And it was literally mayhem, you know? And
Sounds like it.
families, working families, had to figure out a way to live in that. Yo, dude, like, families that lived in a lot of these buildings, like, their boilers would break and they would have to leave their apartments and go outside to, like, a fire hydrant and open the fire hydrant and get water from the fire hydrant and put it in, like, gallon containers and take it upstairs to their apartments. or like, sleep with the oven on because it'd be cold during the winter. Like, this was the Bronx, and this is why, for example, when you watch movies like Wild Style or Beach Street, and there's like, one of the coolest scenes in Beach Street is like about 10, 15 minutes into the movie. Double K, the DJ, goes to this abandoned apartment and he throws a party, and us girls are rapping and Rocksteady's there.
It's working party?
Right, it's working,
Yeah.
right. And they're inside this abandoned apartment. That really happened. And that was really the Bronx. But the thing is it's easy to watch a movie and sort of like gloss over that. Like, I see, but I'm a different kind of person. My thing is, why are they inside of an abandoned building? Why isn't the DJ inside of a nightclub? Right. Why is it an abandoned building inside of this apartment and people have scarves on?
Right.
Dancing during the winter. Why is that? And so because I asked those questions, this is the information that I sort of, excavated, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And connected the dots to hip hop.
Yeah. So with all that being said, it was so much poverty going on. How does hip hop get birth from those conditions?
So I think it's important for me to touch on the fact that I'm trying to find like a tactful way of saying this, right? Without being like too abrasive. Hip hop, its origins aren't pretty. You know what I'm saying? Its origins aren't pretty. The precursor to what DJs like Kool Herc, Africa Bambaataa, Grandmaster Flash did in the 1970s, Bronx, New York, is gang culture.
Yeah.
In the late 1960s, early 1970s, gangs like the Savage Nomads, the Savage Skulls, the Seven Immortals, the Seven Crowns, the Ghetto Brothers, the Black Spades ran New York City. New York City was gang infested. And you couldn't throw a park jam with there being different gangs, because in New York City in that period, you couldn't be like 14, 15, 16 years old and not be a part of a gang, because that was your brotherhood, that was your protection.
Wow.
And in some ways there was positive aspects of gang culture because gangs policed their neighborhoods, because again, we had policies like benign neglect. Police weren't supervising the streets. Gangs policed their own neighborhoods. So gangs were like protectors of where they lived. Right? And in a lot of ways, that's how hip hop, gang culture, and graffiti are connected. You would mark your territory. You would take a spray can and mark your territory. The Seven Immortals or the Ghetto Brothers. And so if you were in this neighborhood and you saw the mark of whatever particular gang ran that section of the Bronx, you knew not to start trouble, or you were going to get your ass kicked, to put it bluntly, or worse, you were going to get stabbed up or shot and killed, right? So in that weird sense, there was some positive aspects to gang culture, because again, they policed their own neighborhoods because the police didn't care and they weren't supervising the city. But at the end of the day, there's nothing really, it's not like being in a gang is gonna have you end up in a good place. You know what I mean? Like when you're in a gang, you're gonna, for the most part, your future's already, talk about graffiti and it's written on the wall what's gonna happen to you, where you're gonna end up. You're gonna either end up dead, in jail. And so this was an issue for the city. And speaking of ending up dead or in jail, there was a watermark moment in 1971, a guy by the name of Cornell Benjamin, his nickname was Black Benji. He was in a group, or a gang, I should say, called the Ghetto Brothers.
Okay.
And the president of the Ghetto Brothers was a guy named Yellow Benji. And Black Benji was a warlord. And what that basically means is, as a warlord, you are the one in the gang that's designated with the responsibility to decide whether you're going to go to war with a rival gang or whether there's going to be peace.
So wait a minute.
Mm-hmm.
The warlords were a real thing? Because when I think of the warlords, I think of Good Times and, you know, how JJ was trying to be a part of the warlords. That was an actual gang.
The warlords in this context were, each gang had a warlord.
Okay.
And that person was designated with the responsibility of maintaining the gang culture,
Sure.
the tenets of the gang, and deciding whether or not his gang was going to go to war with another gang, or if they were at war with another gang, when would be the appropriate time to broker peace between his gang and the other gang.
Oh, okay. I got you.
But Good Times, I think that takes place in Chicago, right?
Chicago. Yeah.
They had their
Own thing.
similar experience that people in the Bronx did. So I love that you referenced Good Time, because there was some symmetry there.
Okay.
Watts, same thing. In Detroit, same thing.
Yep.
Good Times, I missed that show, man, because it was real. It was real. It was the black experience. And you're a kid from Queens. Dude, I grew up in a tenement building in Jackson Heights, Queens. 1-bedroom apartment. My father and mother, my father immigrated to New York City in like 1969. Got a job at a factory. Minimum wage at the time for a factory worker was like $4.50. And all he could afford was a 1-bedroom apartment. And so in like 1970, 71, he sent for my older brother and my mom to come to New York. And I was born in 1972. I know I don't look it. I look like 21. But I'm old. I'm 51. And so, yeah, I get it. When you reference Good Times, the reason I bring that up is because I remember, dude, growing up in a 1-bedroom apartment. I had rats and roaches as roommates.
Wow.
My brother and I used to sleep on cots in the living room, and my dad and my mom slept in their room.
Right.
But we slept on cots, bro, in the living room. And then, like, we'd wake up in the morning, fold the cots up, move them to, like, a corner in the living room, eat some cereal for breakfast, and then walk to school. And it's not like, you know, we had, you know, buses or anything like that. Again, like, the city was really underfunded. So we would, like, walk to school, and, you know, we were kids that basically took care of themselves because our parents had to work.
Yep.
So it's not like the way things are now where, like, kids, you know, have helicopter parents and kids are spoiled. Like, nah, me and my brother, we fended for ourselves. So when you reference Good Times, you took me right back to 3752 89th Street, Jackson Heights, growing up, you know, throwing shoes at mice in my apartment or opening the cupboards and seeing roaches, but thinking that's normal because I saw it on Good Times. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like, you know what I mean? That's kind of normal. Right. And again, I'm driving through, I can't help but continuing to reference the houses that I saw today, bro. When I was going to the mall, and like the lawns and just how pretty everything looked. I did not grow up that way. Yeah. And neither did the people in the Bronx. So again, to circle back to this water bench moment, Black Benji, who was a warlord of the Ghetto Brothers, was sent to broker a peace truce between two separate rival gangs.
Right.
So it wasn't even that the Ghetto Brothers were, you know, had static with another gang. It was gangs that had not a gang beef that had nothing to do with the Ghetto Brothers. So he was sent to broker it, a peace deal. At this meeting, he got killed. He got killed. He went with a couple of members of the Ghetto Brothers. Obviously, I wasn't there. I was not even born yet. It's 1971. I was born in 72. But I've talked to people from that era, elder statesmen, so to speak, of hip hop that basically broke the story down to me, and I've done research on it. And it's actually stuff you could Google. It's information that's on the internet. So Black Benji went to broker this peace deal between these rival gangs. Something erupted and a rumble took place, and Black Benji got killed. And after Black Benji's death, Yellow Benji, the president of the Ghetto Brothers, called all of the gangs in the city to have a meeting. And at that meeting, it's, again, something that it's documented. You could Google all this information. At this meeting, and there's video as well, he basically pleaded with the warlords of each gang for there to be peace because they lost, Black Benji. And Black Benji was just a staple in the Ghetto Brothers and in the Bronx.
Right.
And so it sort of reminds me of the scene in the movie The Warriors. Anyone here seen the movie Warriors? Remember the opening scene where Cyrus, the leader of the Gramercy Riffs, holds the citywide meeting with all of the gangs? That movie, The Warriors, it's fiction, but it's not fiction. That was really the Bronx, New York City in the 1970s.
Wow.
It was really like that. And so in the movie, Cyrus is saying, why are we rumbling against each other? We need to call a truce. We could run this city together.
Right.
And that's, literally what happened after Black Benji's death. Yellow Benji called this citywide truce amongst all the gangs, and they went with it. They followed suit. That's not to say that remnants of gang culture didn't continue on. It's not like from one day to the next there was just peace. Obviously, you still had muggings. It's not like gangs stopped operating, but they decided to have an overall truce.
Right.
I say that's a water bench moment in hip hop because that truce facilitated the space, the means for DJs like Disco King Mario, Kool Herc,
Sure.
Africa Bambaataa,
Yep.
Grandmaster Flash, Eddie Chiba to throw the park jams, because without a truce, you were not going from one neighborhood to the next because you risked getting jumped or worse. So you would stay in your neighborhood, but now there was a truce, so you could venture out from your block and go to a different part of the Bronx, Soundview, or the South Bronx, or the West Bronx, where Kool Herc DJ'd his first party, on 1520 Cedric Avenue. This truce created that space.
Right.
And so referencing gang culture, how it was the precursor to hip hop, I hope I made that connection for you guys. That it's not, here we are, 2023, we're celebrating the 50th year of hip hop. And I think the average person just kind of assumes Kool Herc woke up one day and had a conversation with his sister about throwing a back to school party, and they did it and people showed up and that was the first hip hop party. And then 50 years later, here you and I are having this conversation. No, there were circumstances in New York City that created the perfect ingredients for hip hop to cultivate itself.
Okay, so fast forward just a little bit. I know you were in 71. We're going to go to 1977. There was a blackout. And this blackout, I've watched former podcasts where you talk about this blackout and how it impacted hip hop. Can you elaborate on how that blackout correlates to hip hop?
Totally. So things are calmer with regards to gang culture in the mid 70s. by now you had these parties inside apartments that were within decrepit, dilapidated buildings that were just burnt out, right? All you pretty much had left in the Bronx, places like the South Bronx, Soundview, the West Bronx, were predominantly blacks and Puerto Ricans.
Right.
And you had these DJs throwing these parties because it's funny because like as I'm saying this, I'm thinking there was a sort of redlining segregation happening within the DJ discipline as well. You know, it's not like Kool Herc or Bam or Flash invented DJing. They weren't the first DJs. Right. There were DJs like David Mancuso, Francis Grazzo, that were playing the same music in nightclubs in the Lower East Side of Manhattan or Midtown. David Mancuso lived in the Village, had a loft, and he would throw parties inside his loft and charge people to get in. And at these parties, he was playing the same music that Kool Herc, Bam, Flash were playing. And so the reason I bring that up is because DJing was a thing that was taking place, especially with the boom of disco music. Right. But the relevance there is that Herc, Bam, Flash had this pigment.
Right.
So it's not like they could, you know, schmooze their way into a nightclub in Manhattan and DJ. They weren't the right color.
Right.
You know, DJs who were Italian were getting those gigs.
Right.
So in a weird way, even DJing experienced its own sort of segregation and redlining.
Right.
Not necessarily on purpose, but again, it was just kind of remnants, ripple effects of these policies that I referenced earlier. So they were resourceful. And what they did was they threw parties in parks. For electricity, they would connect their gear to lampposts.
Right.
How crazy is that? Like the risk
yes.
that they were taking just to play music.
Yeah.
And again, they weren't supervised. So it's not like they were, you try to do that today, cops are ending the party.
They're on you.
Right, they're on you. Back then, there was no supervision. No one cared what these kids were doing in the Bronx. Yeah. So in a weird way, it created this opening for them to do whatever they want and for this culture to start, you know, growing its roots. Mm-hmm. And so parties were taking place courtesy of, again, Herc, Bam, Flash. But here's the thing. It was an exclusive club of DJs that were throwing parties.
Right.
It's not like when you consider all that I've talked about with regards to the poverty that was affecting the Bronx, New York City. The reason the 1977 blackout is relevant to this discussion now is because when the blackout happened, kids, teenagers ran inside these stores like the Wiz, like Crazy Eddie, and looted the gear you needed to DJ. Right? Yeah. Again, there was no supervision in the Bronx. So this is another watershed moment in hip hop because more DJs evolved from that night. So looting took place, and as a result, more people had the gear. So more people started DJing.
Right.
So that caused the roots of hip hop to then spread out and the tree to start to form.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? That moment. Something else that I wanted to kind of circle back to that I feel is an important watershed moment. 2023, we're going to be celebrating 50 years of hip hop. The first hip hop party started or was launched or birthed in August 11th, 1973. How is that possible if hip hop is a combination of four elements and no one was breaking at this party? And it's not like we had graffiti writers, you know, painting murals as DJ Kool Herc was rocking. And it's not like people were rapping. Rapping the way we know it to be didn't exist. Coke LaRock, Kool Herc's rapper, and the person that we coin as being the first rapper in hip hop, wasn't rapping at this party. It was just a DJ playing music.
Right.
Nothing different from what David Mancuso was doing in The Village or Francis Grazzo was doing in spots like the Sanctuary.
Right.
Clubs.
Right.
Kool Herc was just doing it inside a rec room at 1520 Cedric Avenue. But why do we say this is the first hip hop party?
Right.
That is like my gripe with a lot of this stuff. You know what I mean?
For sure.
Again, I feel like what we're celebrating is the start of one man's career.
Sure.
That's actually what we're celebrating, is the start of Kool Herc's career. That said, please don't get mad at me because I'm not diminishing Kool Herc's place in hip hop. Dude, I see Kool Herc and I feel like I'm staring at God sometimes, dude. Because like he has the beard and the dreads, and there's just an energy around him, and you're just like, yo, that's Kool Herc, and you're just staring at him, And I've seen him DJ, and you're just like, and it's not like Kool Herc is like super technical or any of that, but it's Kool Herc, right? So it's like I have the utmost respect for him. He's gonna be inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
Right.
That's amazing. Well deserved. I applaud it. But within the history and context of hip hop, I feel what we're actually celebrating is the start of his career on August 11th, 1973, not the start of hip hop. The start of hip hop, to answer your question, was the early 1980s. That's when the term started to be used. And that's when the framers needed to give it a name. That's when the pioneers needed to label it as something, because the media started to recognize it and discover it.
Right.
In the 70s, no one knew this was taking place in the Bronx. This was just something that was unique to people in the Bronx and people that were down. By 1981, the media took hold of this thing that was happening in the Bronx because they were documenting that decade of fires.
Right.
So it's funny, indirectly, the slumlords that were burning their buildings down, displacing families, was creating this media attention. I don't know if anyone here or anyone watching has seen a movie called, it's a series, right? It aired on television, called The Bronx is Burning, about the New York Yankees. Mm-hmm. And when they were in the World Series, the sportscasters that were narrating the game would talk about a camera shot of a building on fire as the World Series is taking place.
Wow.
And saying like, well, what do we have here? What's there? Looks like there's a building on fire as the game is being played. So these fires brought media to the Bronx to be like, yo, what's going on here? Like, why are these buildings burning?
Right.
Why is there all this poverty and debris everywhere and trash? Like, it's like a war zone here. So when the media started to document the ongoings in the Bronx, indirectly, they discovered hip hop, which wasn't called hip hop at the time. It was just a thing that Black
Everybody
and Puerto
was
Rican
doing.
kids were doing. And then saying, well, we're here to document this fire that happened last night, but we heard this music coming from this park a block away. Let's go see what that's about. And pulling up on a kid with turntables outside, cutting it up, and someone rapping. And then these 12, 13, 14-year-old kids breaking on cardboard. Like, what's going on here? You know what I mean? And then documenting it, making a little story on the news about this thing, this movement of creativity that's taking place. And once people saw that on the news, it started to grow more. And this is now the early 1980s when songs like Rapper's Delight dropped.
Right.
Songs like Rapture, Blondie. Blondie is a punk rock group, and the lead singer of that group is Deborah Harry. And if you watch the video for Rapture, it starts off with this like punk rock girl singing. You know, you could tell she's in Manhattan. You know, she's like this, you know, cute chick singing. And then she like goes into this like, I don't know, like this lower level underground room inside like a building. And I feel like it's sort of fitting, like the imagery, because she went from being like this like Sex in the City type of girl walking in New York singing to going into this underground room where there's a guy with turntables staring at her while she's singing. And then there's a guy by the name of Fab Five Freddy graffiti painting on the wall in the video. So it's like, if you never heard this interview with B-Man and I, and you watch that video, that might kind of go over your head. But now that you're hearing me say that, watch the video again and you see, oh, like the white people from the village that didn't want to have anything to do with the Bronx now are coming into the Bronx because of this, I don't know, I don't want to call it a craze or a trend because it's 50 years now, right?
Right.
But this thing that was bubbling, that it's in the news, they wanted a part of now.
Right.
And that's when it started to really grow and multiply this wave. Because it wasn't just these Puerto Rican and black kids doing it by themselves. Now, white folk, and I gotta credit Fab Five Freddy, man. He was down, he was a graffiti writer, but he used to hang out in places like the Village with punk rockers, places that Grandmaster Flash, Bambaataa, Kool Herc weren't going to. These guys just stayed in the Bronx. There are pictures of Fab Five Freddy with Basquiat, who's a famous artist. Andy Warhol and Fab Five Freddy. So the reason I feel Fab Five Freddy deserves a lot of credit, and I don't understand why he doesn't get it, is because he would convince these people that owned art galleries that were caking off people like Basquiat off their paintings. He would convince them to go to the Bronx with them to discover and experience what was happening in the Bronx that no one in the outer boroughs, unless you were down, knew. There are pictures of like Fab Five Freddy, Grandmaster Flash, and Deborah Harry. Like it's a random like threesome of people, but he was the mediary, so to speak. He was the common denominator between the punk rock scene that was blowing up in the Village and the Lower East Side and the quote unquote hip hop scene that there wasn't even a name for it yet, that was blowing up in the Bronx. So he would bring these people up to the Bronx and like hang out with them like, yo, isn't this cool? And it'd be like Rocksteady Crew breaking or Grandmaster Flash cutting up Take Me to the Mardi Gras. You're in the Bronx, you come from Manhattan, and you're this punk rocker, this new waver, and you're meeting the graffiti writers that tag up the trains that you ride. Like now you're interacting in this world. Fab Five Freddy was the intermediary of that whole thing. And so I personally feel if it wasn't for Fab Five Freddy, I don't know if hip hop would have been as popular and as prime to then explode into the next phase, which was Hollywood and, you know, tours in Europe with Rocksteady Crew. Fab Five Freddy helped facilitate that. Him, along with Africa Bambaataa, who then created, by then, the tenets for hip hop: peace, unity, love, having fun. They, I feel, were the ones that coined, or I shouldn't say coined, Keith Cowboy. Cool Keith Cowboy is the one that coined the term hip hop in a rap. But I feel from my research, from what I've gathered, the information tells me that it was actually Bambaataa and dudes like Fab Five Freddy that sat with dudes in suits that were now getting ready to package this thing that was happening in the Bronx and sell it to the world.
Yep.
It was dudes like Bambaataa and Fab Five Freddy that were like, well, what are we going to call it? Like, what do you call a product?
Yeah.
You can't just sell it and be like, yo, it's the jam. Because that's what they called parties, jams.
Right.
When breakers would go to the floor and spin on their head and do windmills, they would be like, yo, he's going off or he's rocking. These are the terms that we or they used to label what was happening in that first decade. You can't call a product rocking.
Right.
We're going to sell rocking. Or here, we're going to package this product, breaking, graffiti, MCing, DJing, and call it the go off.
Right.
You know what I mean?
No.
They decided hip hop. This is what we're going to call it. And this is what it looks like. It has 4 elements: graffiti, breaking, DJing, rapping. It has tenets: peace, unity, love, having fun. I personally feel the tenets that Bambaataa gave it was a means for him to not scare the public at large that they were going to sell this product to, because it was black kids, Puerto Rican kids that, to be honest with you, had a stigma attached to them, you know, and they're coming from the Bronx. So it's like, you're going to sell us this thing that like criminals do, quote unquote.
Right.
They, you know, poor kids do, quote unquote. They had to package it a certain way. So they gave it the name, they gave it the ingredients, the 4 ingredients, they gave it the tenets, and it became hip hop. So for me, hip hop actually started, I would say, in like 1982.
Okay.
So I personally feel that hip hop is 40, not 50.
Wow.
And that we're celebrating the 50th year of Kool Herc's first party.
Right.
Not the 50th year of the first hip hop party. There's a difference. And I know there might be people that I might get in trouble with because I'm saying that. And hip hop brings with it a lot of dogma and a lot of narratives that they can't change, and this is what it is, and you gotta tell the story this way. But I'm a different kind of dude. You know what I mean?
I know you are.
So yeah, I'm glad that you brought all this up, because at least now this information is out there. It's provocative, and then you guys do whatever you want with it. You could do your own research, you know, and connect the dots in your own way. But I know for a fact that what we call and consider and recognize as being hip hop was not taking place at that one party on 1520 Cedric Avenue on August 11th, 1973.
Not at all. So let's dial into, you mentioned, you know, b-boying. That was a big part of hip hop, still is. Let's circle in on graffiti, because that's considered the 4th element of hip hop, right?
No doubt. Yeah. Well, the first thing I would say is that during the first decade of hip hop,
sure,
graffiti really wasn't a part of that concoction that was taking place. Although we're far enough removed that now if you watch a movie like B Street or Wild Style, you just assume that, oh yeah, graffiti writers were there at the parks too. I don't necessarily think that that was the case. Actually, I know that wasn't the case, because graffiti writers themselves, I'm not talking about people that started writing graffiti in the 80s. I'm talking about like original first generation graffiti writers would tell you they were listening to punk rock or rock. A lot of them were like white guys. Obviously you had black people, Puerto Rican people, and other people from the Latino realm, culture doing it, but it wasn't like they necessarily wanted anything to do with what was happening at these park jams, because they were in the yards getting dirty, painting the trains, and sleeping all day because they were up till 5, 6 in the morning painting in the yards.
Right.
Or at home perfecting their signatures, their tags. Excuse me. So if you're a graffiti writer and you're at home perfecting your tag on a black book, or you're a graffiti writer leaving their house at 1 a.m. to go paint, you're not at some park jam at 1 p.m. You're sleeping
Right.
and getting ready to do the same thing later on that night. Okay. So graffiti, I wouldn't necessarily say became a part of hip hop until the 80s, when guys like Fab Five Freddy, who was also a graffiti writer, and Africa Bambaataa decided, well, a lot of the breakers and MCs and DJs are graffiti writers too now, because there's this thing happening where like everyone is just kind of experimenting and interacting with these different facets of creating and self-expression. Why don't we just, bunch it up with the other 3 elements anyway?
Right.
So you feel what I'm saying? You guys
Right,
get what
yeah.
I'm saying? So yeah, like graffiti wasn't necessarily part of hip hop. It was its own thing. It was already happening way before 1973. As early as 1968, there was a guy named Cornbread who wrote graffiti in Philadelphia. And then New York City had Taki 183, who's considered one of the first, if not the first, graffiti artists. But it's not that they were painting these burners meaning like these amazing, like, 10 feet murals or anything like that. They were just writing their name everywhere. It was tagging that initiated the graffiti movement, tagging. And I was a tagger too. I used to write graffiti. My tag was Rob Ski. Big up to my boy Nay.
Okay.
He named me Rob Ski. He was like, and at the time with graffiti writers, you always had a mentor. You had a mentor, and then that mentor would give you your name, and then you would figure out how you were going to write the name, and then it was your job to get your name up everywhere and go viral, so to speak. And so my boy Nay, Joey, named me Rob Ski, and so I went with the name. I didn't know what the reference to ski was. I just felt like my mentor is giving me this name. I need to get it up as many places as I can. And so I say that to say that graffiti was prevalent in the first decade of hip hop, but it was happening more so parallel to the movement
Right.
that was nameless.
Right.
It wasn't necessarily a part of that movement. That's not to say that there weren't DJs that didn't write graffiti as well, but it's like you separated it. You wrote graffiti and you DJ'd, but you didn't really combine the two. And when the media started to take hold of this thing that was happening, when Hollywood decided to make movies about it, guys like Fab Five Freddy and Africa Bambaataa were like, all right, we have DJing, we have MCing, we have breaking. So there's the dance, there's the oral representation of this culture, and then there's the music, the songs that describe what we like and what we're about. We need an art representation, and so they tied in graffiti. And that's why, like, I would say if you guys look at the early flyers from, let's say, 1978 through 1980, none of those flyers have the word hip hop on them, and none of those flyers have graffiti on them. It's, party at such and such school, PS, whatever public school, we're throwing a jam, and Grand Wizard Theodore is going to be there, and the Fantastic Five Freaks are going to be there, and Cold Crush Brothers, or Park Jam at this park, at this time, but you will not see the word hip hop and you will not see graffiti as we know it to be on any flyer up until maybe 1981, 1982. Then that, again, guys like Fab Five Freddy and Bam decided, yo, let's make this a part of this movement. And then you started seeing the graffiti in videos like Buffalo Gals, Malcolm McLaren. The media started to tie graffiti into what was happening with regards to hip hop now. You saw it in the documentary Style Wars, which is really about graffiti, but it was dope how they also touched on the fact that a lot of these writers were break dancers,
right,
and DJs, and that there was this thing happening in the Bronx called hip hop.
right.
But all those interesting little anecdotes and circumstances indirectly created what we're talking about today.
Right.
You know?
Yep.
So it's crazy. It's a crazy arc when you think about it.
Absolutely. Now, was there a defining moment that maybe, like, for some of us, for me, it was watching, Soul Train and situations like that, where you sat down and you're like, hey, I see this guy doing that. That may be what I want to do.
For sure. Well, my dad was one of those defining moments.
Sure.
Seeing him take a room full of people and control them without speaking, for me, was a power.
For sure.
And it made me look up to my dad. Watching my brother made me want to do this DJing thing because it looked fun.
Right.
And I realized through my brother that playing music or breaking or writing graffiti or rapping was a way for me to connect with my inner creativity.
Right.
And now looking back, I realize that when you do that, I don't mean to sound corny, but I really feel like you're connecting with God. Like you're connecting with the part of you that is in your DNA, right? That is meant for you to create. Whether you write rhymes or write graffiti or DJ or spin on your head.
Right.
These are amazing forms of expression that you don't learn at some formal school. It's
Right.
like you just kind of come up with it on your own organically.
Right.
If that's not God inspiring you, I don't know what is. You know what I'm
Right.
saying? So I'm thankful to my brother for being that, I don't know, that gateway to this culture. And I'm thankful to my dad for buying the equipment and not getting mad at me for using it when he found out that we ended up, using his equipment when he didn't want us to anyway.
Right.
But to answer your question on a larger scale, when you were saying, is there a one person or a one incident that you could point to that made you feel like that's what I want to do? You referenced Soul Train. I have a really cool story for you, man. When I was about 14 years old, so it had to be like 1986. I remember sitting in the living room of my apartment with my dad, and we were watching the first ever televised Soul Train Music Awards.
Right.
And LL Cool J walked out on stage carrying a massive radio,
Right.
and he performed the single to his second sophomore album, I'm Bad,
Right.
which was I'm Bad. That was the name of the single.
Right.
And he walks out on stage and he's looking at the crowd. I remember he was wearing like a leather suit. It was purple. He had a white Kangol on, and he just looked so like confident and in charge. And like he knew who he was and what his purpose on that stage was. You know what I mean? And
Right.
he just oozed power.
Right.
And I was just mesmerized looking at him. And I remember I turned to my dad. Like, my dad was actually like this far away from me. And I was like, Dad, that's what I want to do. That's what I want to do. And I was like 14 years old. So LL had to be like 18, 19 years old by then, right?
Right.
And my dad looked at me and laughed. He laughed. He was like, come on, Rob, like, really? And, you know, it's interesting because it's not like I took it personally. I think I understood at 14 that to him, an immigrant to New York City from Colombia, my dad's family were miners in a part in Colombia called Chocó, a region of Colombia that's by the coast.
Right.
And where Africans were dropped off during the, you know, transportation of slaves in the 1600s. So if any of you guys go to Chocó now, Colombia, it's nothing but people of this pigment, you know? And so I think at 14, I understood that, like, he just doesn't have the foresight that I have, you know? Right. And so I didn't take it personally, but I think a part of me was like, all right, I guess I'll just prove you wrong,
right.
You know? So I remember seeing that image of LL walk on stage, and it just kind of got implanted in my head.
Right.
Fast forward a couple of months after that, my brother and my best friend at the time, Psycho Les, who at the time was just Lester to me, and now you guys may know him as one half of a group called the Beat Nuts.
Right.
He and I went to junior high school together, and my brother actually taught us both how to DJ.
Right.
And it was Les that convinced me to ask my brother to teach us how to DJ. So fast forward a couple of months after watching LL, my brother, myself, and Psycho Les are inside my dad's car. We're going record shopping.
Right.
In Manhattan. And we cross the 59th Street Bridge. And at the end of the bridge, there's like this tram that you see people taking to go to Roosevelt Island. And at the tram, there's a red light. And then you could go left or right? On 59th Street. So we're at the red light waiting. And then a car pulls up to our right. And we look because there was hip hop coming out of it. And it's LL Cool J.
Oh, wow.
And LL's looking at us like he's sitting like this, looking at us. And I remember he had a like his boy in the passenger seat, and they actually looked alike. They looked very similar, and they both had Kangol on. They had like wife beaters on.
Yeah.
And LL looked at me and like did a bicep, and I was like, "Yo!" And Les was like, "Yo!" And my brother was like, "Yo, that's LL." And like he made a bicep at us, and we were just like, yo, this is crazy. And then he pulls off, and then we started like chasing him.
Right.
And cause I'm like, yo, we're like, that's LL Cool J. And I remember like we're chasing him.
What was he driving, by the way?
He was driving a red Audi.
Ooh.
And we were in like a Ford LTD. Cause my dad loved like those big ass Ford cars, right? So and we're chasing him, and I remember vividly seeing his eyes like look at us in his rear view mirror from our car, and just thinking like, yo, that's LL's eyes looking at me right now, like in his rear view. And you know, eventually he lost us, right?
Yeah.
But that was like crazy. That was like a crazy moment. Fast forward like a year or two later, this is when LL was having his beef with Ice-T. I don't know if you guys remember, but LL had like a huge beef with Ice-T. Now I'm like 16, 17 years old, and the New Music Seminar was taking place. The New Music Seminar was like a seminar where rappers would assemble in New York City and have conventions on the rap industry.
Right.
And they actually had a famous battle called the New Music Seminar Battle that ended in 1994. And we could get into that later. But we're at the Palladium on 14th Street. And myself, Psycho Les, and my brother, the three of us always hung out together. My brother was like our caretaker in a way, like our chaperone.
How much older was he than you?
My brother is like 6-7 years older than me.
Okay.
So at the time I was like 17 years old. He was probably like 24, 25.
Okay. All right.
So my brother took us to the Palladium because we couldn't get in there without adult supervision. And we're inside the Palladium hanging out, and we see Ice-T. And we're like, oh, there's Ice-T. And we're like, man, geeking out. And a circle formed where people started dancing.
Right.
And in walks LL Cool J.
Right.
And we're like, yo, there's LL. Oh, man, LL. And then there's Ice-T, and we knew about the beef. So we're like, yo, what's going to happen? Like, are they going to fight? So this circle breaks out, and there are people dancing. And, yo, I swear to God, I'm not lying to you guys. Ice-T and LL had a dance-off.
What?
And we're, yo, yes.
That sounds crazy.
It was amazing, bro. So Ice-T went in the circle, and like he's dancing, and he's like up rocking, but like not going to the floor. And then LL gets in the circle and starts looking at Ice-T and dances, and we're like, yo, this is insane. I kid you not, bro.
Wait a minute. LL Cool J can dance.
Yeah.
And what year is
look,
this?
Crush Groove. Look at the end of Crush Groove. Baby blue Kangol on, black leather on. And at the end, he walks out, like, as the credits are rolling, and he starts up rocking at the very end of Crush Groove. So I know LL was a B-boy. And I know he was a dancer.
What year is this?
The Palladium incident was, I want to say, 1988, 1989.
Okay. All right.
This was before the Walk with the Panther album.
Okay.
He had like a Till the Break of Dawn. That was out.
Yeah.
And he destroyed Ice-T on that song, man. Respect to Ice-T, but yeah, LL destroyed him. That moment where LL was like, wow, these dudes are having a dance-off. Fast forward now years later, I'm about to board a plane to go to the Essence Festival in New Orleans. I got tapped to do some DJ workshops down there. This is now like the early 2000s. I hadn't seen LL for a minute, right? And so I'm at the gate waiting to board. There's LL. I'm like, oh shit, there's LL. And I'm looking at him, and you know, I just can't get my eyes off him, man, because it's LL Cool J. And he's been this like image of what I've wanted to do and how I've wanted to experience myself with regards to hip hop, more than any of the breakers that I saw in movies, more than any of the DJs, to be honest with you. Although I was inspired by guys like Grand Mixer DST and Mixmaster Ice and Cash Money, more than the rappers of that era, Treacherous 3, Fearless 4. LL, I feel, to me, symbolized that you can do this and make a lot of money.
Oh, yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Whereas those guys were just like, yeah, you could do this. Yeah, you could experience yourself creatively as a rapper or as a graph writer if you were Fuzz in my neighborhood, or as a DJ, Grandmaster Flash. But LL to me was like a symbol of like, you could walk on the stage of an award show and be paid to be there and rap. Yeah. And that's what I was trying to get my dad to understand, and it just didn't click for him. So when I saw LL about to enter the plane and sit down, I remember just thinking like, yeah, man, like someday, man, like, you know, I'll get to the point where like I'll feel that kind of financial freedom that I know this guy's feeling right now. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
Still had a mortgage back then, and you know, you're kind of each month you're hustling and scratching and clawing to get the bills paid, but somehow God's making a way for you to do it.
Right.
And then the pandemic happened, right? And I launched the school, Brolic Army DJ School.
Correct.
And it's my best fiscal year of my entire career. I would say my DJ career officially started in 1993 when Akinelli tapped me to be his DJ. That I would say is the year 1993 that my career officially started. But each year was a hustle, and you scratched and clawed to make ends meet and get by. And even when I moved out of my parents' apartment, I don't even know how. Now looking back, sometimes I'm like, I know how. It's God, right?
Yeah.
But like you're like, how? That said, how did I make the bills at the end of every month? And I had a mortgage. How did I pay for the furniture in my apartment off DJing? Like, it just didn't make sense to me, right? But pandemic comes, and I have the best fiscal year of my entire career. And that year, I pay my mortgage off. And that year, I launched my school that has now turned into my business. Like, it's my business. Regardless of what happens with me regarding DJing, if I lose a contract, if I don't get booked for a tour, my school will always keep me financially secure. And and that is a blessing, and I thank God for that, right? And so right after the pandemic, when things started to open up, I get a call from Z-Trip. And Z-Trip is LL Cool J's DJ.
Right.
Random call, and he's like, yo, Rob, what's up? Zach, what up? We're talking. He's like, yo, man, check it out. LL got booked to perform at Central Park. This is July. Well, I got the call like in June of 2021, but the actual concert was taking place in July. And he's like, yo, Zach is like, yo, LL is doing this concert he got booked for in July, but I'm actually going to be on the road and I can't do it. So he was like, LL and I talked and we want you to DJ.
Wow.
And yo, I was like holding the phone, trying to be cool.
Right.
But in my head, I was doing backflips.
Yeah.
And like there were fireworks going off.
Yeah.
And I was just like, damn, Zach, bro, like, thank you. And yes, I will do it. And just tell me when is rehearsal and what I got to do. And yo, dude, like it was, you know, I'm a talker, right? I think I talked more than him on the call. Like I was that excited. And he was like, yeah, dude. And I remember him telling me, I mean, think about this, guys. Like, it's New York, the birthplace of hip hop. There's a gazillion DJs they could have got.
Right.
And a lot of DJs that are more popular than me that they could have got, you know, Funkmaster Flex and guys that are on the radio and DJ Enough, like in respect to all those guys. But for whatever reason, they chose me. You know what I mean? And so we went to rehearsals. I'm there with the band, you know, sizing up what it is that I got to do. Preparing. LL actually wasn't at the first rehearsal. And then the next day we went to Central Park to rehearse, like do a cold run of the actual performance. And I remember like I'm on stage sorting through my sounds, getting ready, and I hear Rob Swift. And I turn around and it's LL Cool J.
Insane.
And I'm just like full fucking circle, man.
Yeah.
Full circle. Excuse me for cursing, but that's how,
good.
like,
You're good.
I feel the excitement that I felt that moment. And I looked at him and like got off my little DJ podium and walked up to him and I just shook his hand and I was like, yo, dude, thank you, man. Thank you. He was like, nah, no problem, Robbie. Yo, this is going to be dope and we're going to do this. And I'm just... They're like, yo, this is crazy. This is insane. Yeah. And it's the year of the pandemic. You know what I'm saying?
That's even crazy.
Right. So we do the show. And what's cool is it wasn't just him. He brought out Fat Joe, Run DMC, Melly Mel.
What?
Yeah.
And
like
you're DJing?
And I was the DJ. So it's 50 years of hip hop on stage, right?
Yeah.
And I'm the DJ. It's dude, it was crazy. And I remember like we did the show. It's I have the footage on my YouTube page. Anyone that may want to check it out, it's up there.
Please check that out.
So we do the show, we get off stage, and I'm getting my stuff together and I'm getting ready to leave. And I went up to him and I told him the story of my father. How like my father laughed at me when I told him that I wanted to be where you were on that stage.
Right.
When I was 16 years old, walking out on the stage of the Soul Train Music Awards, I told my dad I wanted to be where you were, and here I am where you were on that stage. Like all these years later. So like, I'm glad you asked that question. And LL's like, he's just looking at me like, damn, yo, that's deep. That's deep.
Yeah.
And I remember he was like, yo, Rob, but like, yo, dude, like, I want to do more shit with you. Like, obviously, Z is my DJ, but like, I want us to keep working together, man. Like, this was a lot of fun, and it was just awesome, man. And I guess to wrap up my spiel there, I feel like LL was like an arrow for me. Like, he was an arrow, and that kind of kept pointing me in the direction that led me to where I'm at right now, today, in this chair.
Right.
Every time I ran into him, whether it was like at a red light at the end of the 59th Street Bridge, or at the Palladium, or about to board a plane to go to New Orleans for the Essence Festival, it's like he was this arrow, like, yeah, just keep going that direction. And I'm your arrow, and just keep following me. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? And I ended up on stage with him, literally full circle, bro. So, like, to anyone out there that is DJing, if you're new to this art and you're thinking to yourself, like, man, it's just so many DJs out there, and like, how am I gonna establish myself and make a name for myself with social media the way it is, and there's all this competition? I'm sure there are arrows for you. You just gotta follow them and know which arrows they are. That's because right. You'll see other arrows too pointing you in directions that aren't meant for you to go in.
Correct.
I remember being in college all through the 90s, and on the cusp of graduating college, I remember having lunch with two friends that I went to high school with that went to my college, Monica and Rosemary. And we're sitting down and we're talking about what our plans are after graduating. And they're both like, yeah, we're going to get a job here. And well, I'm thinking about maybe going back to school and getting my master's. And I remember telling them, I think I'm going to devote at least 1 year completely to DJing. And then from there, I'll think about whether I'm going to go back to school or get a job. And I remember both of them looked at me and they were like, are you stupid? Like, that's what you're going to do? DJ for a year? Like, you're going to throw away your degree, and then a year's going to go by. And like, it was all these arrows pointing me, or two at that moment, pointing me in a direction that I knew in my heart I didn't want to go in.
Right.
You know, I felt like LL was like the arrow that was pointing me in the direction that led me here to this chair. So like, for people out there, whether you rap, DJ, whatever it is that you do, follow your passion.
Correct.
Follow your passion to the best of your ability. You will end up exactly where you're supposed to.
Well, I'm just B-Man No DJ, live from the Backspin Studio, Without No DJ podcast. As you know, I have the impeccable Rob Ski, a.k.a.
Yes.
DJ Rob Swift.
Yes, sir. Brolic arm.